Yo, chat. I'm Lenny. It's amazing how much of the Hello Neighbor lore can be brought to life. Even living next to SpongeBob and Patrick can't compare to this background NPCs. So, grab your notebooks and books, or mops and rags, sleep hats or snacks, or whatever you're doing, and let's check out a few tales of neighbors from the absolute Shadow Realm. Yeah, I said it, and no, Kaiba's not saving you. Let's start with a story that begins pretty quietly, with a simple act of kindness, and then turns into something much stranger than anyone expected. There was a story from a lady's mom whose next-door neighbor had built a very convincing image around herself. She appeared sick, seriously sick. She had shaved her head, used a cane, moved slowly, and carried herself like someone going through cancer treatment. To anyone looking in from the outside, she seemed fragile, exhausted, and obviously not in a position to keep up with everyday responsibilities. And because of that, people let things slide. The trash would pile up. The yard would be left unattended. The property around her place gradually became more and more neglected, but no one wanted to be the person complaining about someone who looked like she was barely holding on. One day, the woman's mother decided to do something kind. She baked some cookies, brought them over, and offered to help. Just with the basics, taking care of the bins, maybe helping around the yard a little. That was when the neighbor admitted something no one was expecting. She wasn't sick at all. According to her, it was all an act. The shaved head, the cane, the slow movements, it made life easier. People stopped asking questions. The landlord stopped pushing. Everyone saw her as someone to pity, and as long as that image stayed intact, she could avoid dealing with the mess around her. Once the mother heard that, she contacted the landlord and told him what had really been going on. That was when the situation changed. Not long after, the neighbor started playing loud music late at night, enough to keep people awake. It didn't feel random either. It felt targeted. What had started as a quiet, uncomfortable truth turned into a petty war almost overnight. Eventually, the police got involved. At one point, the neighbor even accused the mother of assaulting her, which, on its face, made very little sense. But fortunately, there were security cameras on the property, and those cameras told a very different story. One night, the neighbor was seen forcing her young daughter outside. The girl, only 9 years old, was left crying and knocking on the door, trying to get back in. Hearing the noise, the mother stepped outside to see what was happening and tried to help the child. That's when the neighbor came out with a garden hose and sprayed her. In the end, the footage made the situation clear enough. The police took the neighbor away, and the child was later sent to live with her father. Yeah, some people really do commit to the bit. That's less troubled neighbor and more full side quest villain energy. But as messy as neighbor conflicts can get, there's something especially disturbing about the moment an innocent animal gets pulled into it. At that point, it's no longer just pettiness, noise complaints, or passive-aggressive behavior. It becomes something else entirely. The next story begins with a white Labrador, sweet, calm, and by every account, completely harmless, which only makes what happened to her even harder to understand. There was a family with a white Labrador. She was friendly, gentle, and not aggressive in the slightest. She stayed in their large, fenced backyard, didn't wander, and wasn't especially loud. By all accounts, she was just a normal, sweet dog. But one of their neighbors, more specifically the wife, had decided otherwise. For reasons that never fully made sense, she had convinced herself that this dog was dangerous. Maybe it was the dog's size. Maybe it was simple paranoia. But in her mind, this Labrador was some kind of threat. She called the police more than once, claiming the dog was terrorizing the neighborhood. Each time the police showed up, met the dog, looked around the property and found nothing alarming. The family explained that the dog never left the yard, and the officers left with the same response each time. Just make sure she stays inside the fence. Still, the complaints continued. After enough calls, the police eventually went back and spoke to the neighbor directly, about how unreasonable her claims were. And after that, something shifted. The family began noticing that their dog was getting sick, often and badly. It happened enough times that they took her to the vet, worried something serious was going on. But the explanation they got was confusing. The vet told them they needed to stop feeding her human food that could be harmful to dogs. That made no sense to them. They weren't feeding her scraps. They had no idea where that could be coming from. So they started paying closer attention. That was when they found out what had really been happening. Their neighbor had been throwing things over the fence into the yard: food scraps, dirty mop water, and other things the family couldn't even identify. The dog had apparently been getting into it, and it had been making her seriously ill. When they confronted the neighbor, she denied it. Eventually, though, they caught her on video, and this time, they made sure she saw them recording. Later that night, her husband came over to apologize. He asked them not to call the police and promised he would make sure his wife left the dog alone from then on. The family agreed, but made it clear that if anything happened to their dog again, they would press charges. Thankfully, the attacks on the dog stopped. But the neighbor didn't stop interfering. Instead, she turned her attention to the yard itself. More than once, she climbed over the fence and trimmed their hedges, which really meant hacking at them and damaging young trees. At one point, she even pulled up an entire flower bed they had only just planted. Again, the family spoke to the husband, who seemed to be the only reasonable one in the situation. And again, it was the same conversation: apologies, reassurances, and a quiet attempt to keep things from escalating further. There were other incidents too, smaller, stranger things they strongly suspected were connected to her, but could never actually prove. Eventually, the woman became seriously ill and passed away. And according to the person telling the story, her husband seemed to become a different person almost immediately afterward. He became warm, friendly, and began inviting them over for barbecues. In time, he even got a small dog of his own. Man, if someone picks a fight with a Labrador, I'm already emotionally on the dog's side. That whole thing feels less like a dispute and more like a glitch in the neighborhood NPC system. Sometimes the problem next door isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. And when that kind of chaos becomes part of daily life, home stops feeling like home pretty quickly.
The next story comes from someone living in a rural part of the South, next door to a man who, according to them, had built a reputation for constant criminal activity and for somehow slipping past serious consequences again and again. Living next to him meant never really knowing what kind of day it was going to be. Sometimes he would ride an ATV up and down the road, firing shots into the air. Other times he and the people around him would gather disturbingly close to the house, close enough that the storyteller specifically mentioned their son's bedroom window. There were incidents involving drugs, repeated trespassing, and even one point where he crashed into their house. The problem didn't stop with him either. People connected to him would show up unexpectedly, sometimes passed out in the driveway. Strange substances would appear in the family's mailbox. And leaving the house for any amount of time came with a new concern: whether the place would still be safe by the time they came back. According to the storyteller, the man was repeatedly tied to drug-related activity in the surrounding woods as well, including makeshift setups that made the area feel even more volatile and unpredictable. Altogether, it created the sense that they weren't just living next to a bad neighbor. They were living next to a constant threat. What made it even harder was the fact that this had happened before. The storyteller said the man had been arrested many times and had accumulated a long list of charges over the years. Every time, it seemed like this would finally be the moment something changed. Every time, the family hoped this would be the last round, but somehow he would return. He would spend a relatively short amount of time in jail, then end up back out on probation. A few months later, the cycle would begin again. By the time the story was posted, the family had already been through this pattern multiple times, and they were exhausted. At that point, they had started thinking seriously about moving. Not because they wanted to leave their home, but because they no longer believed the situation would ever truly be resolved. After the story got attention and people began asking why law enforcement hadn't done more, the storyteller added that they had been reporting everything they could for a long time. In fact, they had become so familiar with local police because of this one neighbor that many of the officers already knew exactly who they were talking about. But knowing hadn't been enough. That's not a bad neighbor. That's a full-on survival mode spawn point. I am really hope that chapter is permanently over and that home actually feels peaceful for you again.
Sometimes the worst part is how quiet it is. How someone can slowly make you feel watched, monitored, and uncomfortable in places that are supposed to feel familiar. The next story is about that kind of neighbor. Not the explosive kind, but the kind who lingers. The kind who keeps showing up just often enough that eventually you stop relaxing altogether. According to the person telling the story, both they and their roommate had a bad feeling about this man from the very first day he moved in. There was nothing specific they could point to at first, just an immediate sense that something about him felt off. And over time, that feeling only got worse. For more than a year, he seemed to appear almost every time either of them stepped outside. If they left the house, he would come out and try to insert himself into the moment, acting as though he simply wanted to talk or spend time with them. Even something as small as walking across the road to check the mail became uncomfortable, because he would often emerge the moment he noticed them. It didn't stop there. Sometimes he would stand in front of their house and stare. Other times he would pace back and forth in the road nearby. Then he began knocking on their door in the middle of the night. They never answered, but later confronted him about it, and he admitted it had been him. There were times when they would leave together and return home only to find him sitting in a chair in their yard, as though the space belonged to him. Eventually, his presence followed them beyond the house. He began appearing at stores and other places around town and trying to trail them there too. By that point, it had stopped feeling like awkward behavior and started feeling deeply invasive. The storyteller said they and their roommate eventually began dreading even going outside. They couldn't enjoy their own yard, couldn't move around comfortably, and couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every quiet moment came with the expectation that he would appear again, and according to them, he almost always did. They reported the issue to their landlord multiple times. The landlord, in turn, warned the neighbor more than once, but none of it seemed to change anything. The behavior continued, and the storyteller believed it probably would have gone on even longer if something unrelated hadn't happened. Eventually, the man fell behind on rent and was forced to move out late the following year. That should have been the end of it. But even after he was gone, what he left behind made an impression of its own. According to the landlord, the house had been left in severe condition. Damaged walls, torn up floors, and signs of heavy substance use throughout the property. The repairs took months, and by the time the storyteller shared the experience, they were still waiting for a new neighbor to move in. And instead of feeling relieved, they felt anxious. What if the next person turned out to be just as bad, or worse? Both roommates had come to the same conclusion. They would leave and start over somewhere else. Hopefully things turned around for you in the best way possible, and your home finally became what it should have been all along. A place where you can feel safe, at ease, and fully yourself. The next story goes in a very different direction. But honestly, it also kind of feeds one of my favorite theories about life. That some people really do wake up every morning convinced they're the main character in a plot no one else agreed to join. Because this neighbor didn't just act suspicious. She acted like she'd been personally assigned a secret mission by the universe. Guys, really, she is the last thing standing between society and total collapse. This woman came across as distant, paranoid, and constantly on edge. She seemed to imagine threats in every direction, and for some reason, that paranoia came with the full confidence of someone who thought she was running a covert operation out of an apartment building. The storyteller said she was always trying to pressure people she viewed as suspicious into moving out. She would stage loud phone calls with what she called headquarters, dramatically talking about the alarming behavior of other tenants. One of the examples the storyteller gave was that she seemed deeply concerned by the fact that they sometimes got home after 9 at night. Apparently, in her world, arriving home in the evening was enough to trigger a full surveillance report. She also regularly yelled at people smoking on the corner. On one occasion, the storyteller overheard her angrily confronting someone about a flower pot in their window, because she had somehow decided that the placement of that flower pot was evidence of drug dealing. Then one afternoon, the whole situation escalated into something even more ridiculous. The storyteller found a notice taped to a wall in the stairwell. It was clearly meant to look official and threatening, but according to them, it was one of the least convincing fake documents they had ever seen. The grammar was terrible, the seal looked badly edited, and there was no legitimate contact information anywhere on it. It looked less like a real warning and more like a prop from a low-budget procedural drama. The notice also mentioned the past 2 years, which made the storyteller suspect they were the main target, since they were, as far as they knew, the only resident whose time in the building lined up that way. Now, the time was finally ripe. The best solution is to stand outside her apartment and stage a fake phone call loud enough for her to hear. They said something along the lines of that the notice was terrible, that impersonating a federal official was a serious crime, and that the real FBI was already on the way to dust it for fingerprints. Within seconds, they heard the neighbor's door open, then the sound of hurried footsteps moving toward the stairwell. When the storyteller stepped back out 5 minutes later, the notice was gone. And according to them, for the entire rest of the time they lived there, that neighbor never bothered them again. Look, I don't know for sure what was going on with her mentally, so I'm not trying to diagnose a stranger over a stairwell conspiracy. But I will say this. Whatever quest she thought she was on, she committed to it with impressive dedication. Folks, after all that, I'm honestly even more convinced that some neighborhoods are just running on secret side quests no one asked for. Like, most people just want a quiet place to exist, but every now and then, real life spawns a character so weird, invasive, or chaotic that the whole block starts feeling procedurally generated. But what do you think? Which neighbor in this batch was the worst? The fake victim, the dog hater, the survival mode menace, the stalker, or the self-appointed apartment agent? Share your personal tier list. Anyway, that's it for this one. Stay safe, protect your save file, and try not to unlock any cursed side quests on your way to the mailbox. I'll be back soon with more weird, uncomfortable, and wonderfully unhinged little stories from the internet. Catch you in the next one, chat.